Hail and well met slayers of giants. Welcome to Chapter 7 of my serial novel, Tilting at Windmills. Remember, this is a draft. I'll be very grateful for your feedback throughout, so please comment away on whatever platform you're finding this, and become a patron of my Patreon or subscribe to my Substack, so you'll get a little reminder each week when a new chapter comes out. Tilting at Windmills, Chapter 7. The Lady of the Lake and New Luggage. Back when he'd worked as a high school English teacher, Benjamin had taught the concept of the epic simile, something students often confused with the epithets of Homer. The blind poet, who is certainly an amalgamation of many poets' labors and may never have existed as a historical individual, employed epithets like swift-footed Achilles and wine-dark sea and wily Odysseus because they fit neatly into the dactylic hexameter that made his poems easier to remember and repeat. His epic similes, in contrast, were long, extended comparisons, which often feel like tangents, but which the poet, in concurrence with the group of poets who must have decided to keep them and likely added their own, felt were necessary to explain something too complex to capture in a line or two. Thus, at the climax of the Odyssey, when Odysseus and Penelope are reunited, Homer leaves them temporarily to tell the story of a completely different sailor who has been lost at sea and clings to a broken piece of the remains of his ship, holding on for dear life, the seeming deviation reported to convey the way Odysseus and Penelope clung to one another upon their reunion. When Benjamin got off the airplane in Cleveland, he went through the same motions as any other visit, calling his parents to inform them he'd arrived and was ready to be picked up, following the signage to the luggage area, marching past the advertisements for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the statue advertising the city as the birthplace of Superman, grabbing the overweight bags which had made their way from Spain to Oregon and now backtracked to Ohio. But once he reached the curb and found his parents, he fell into their arms much like Homer's proverbial sailor. A twinge of shame at his need at the age of 49 to be rescued by his mom and dad kept his tears at bay, and his parents avoided crying by launching into gentle questioning about his next steps, not prying but recognizing his preference for discussing the future as a means to avoid reflecting on the past. Cleveland, at the time of his arrival, experienced a historic freeze. In the age of the Anthropocene, the term historic wields continually diminishing power as each year or two produces the flood of the century, the largest wildfires ever recorded, an unforgettable drought which will be forgotten by its survivors as they weather the next. And surely Cleveland's winter of 25-26 will be remembered as a statistical anomaly measuring somewhere between, was it this cold 2 years ago or was that 3 years ago? But what will be statistical in the future was testicular in the present, because negative 10 degrees, negative 25 wind chill, is enough to make a person suspect his balls will freeze off. The roads were covered by a healthy layer of ice, but the quantity of snow was nothing exceptional for the locals. In fact, the snow which would follow would help insulate the city and bring the temperatures up a bit. That evening, as Homer's rosy fingers of sunset dissolved into a very un-Mediterranean Rust Belt gloom of gray and dirty white, Benjamin reminded himself that, thanks to his parents' help, he would recover in his new home. To its credit, when he'd mentioned the move on social media, the city of Cleveland had responded with distant shouts of welcome. He'd found a group of political activists he looked forward to joining, a not-for-profit which connected creative writing mentors to writers who were incarcerated, and a literary arts group where he planned to pitch some of his new creative writing classes. It would not be the life he'd dreamed of, but it would not be a bad one, and the city's size and vibrant culture might just make for noticeable improvements to the small-town life he'd left, despite the abject failure of the foray to Barcelona in between. Maybe, he thought, Barcelona would be a blip, a bad thing that happened to him, which got him to the place where he'd drop roots and build a satisfying life. But if that were to be the case, how would he remember the marriage which ended in Barcelona, he wondered. He did not want to deceive himself into reducing his soon-to-be ex to a memory of a bad year. That would be unfair to her. He also didn't want to make excuses for her, which would be similarly insulting, inoculating her from culpability by eliminating her agency. If a bad thing simply happened, no one was to blame, but there were no characters in that story. He didn't want to forget her, to lose touch, to move on, but he also didn't want to start his new life with a fictional story of his arrival. He had to tell himself the truth of how he came to be in Cleveland. But he was not ready to tell himself that story. Rolando and Serge had no luggage, Rolando carrying everything he needed in his coat with the mysteriously fecund inner pockets, Serge counting on his new benefactor and promised salary to provide him everything he might need in Cleveland, and at a much higher quality than anything he could have grabbed and tossed in a backpack in his one-bedroom apartment in Portland. Even before entering the airport, in the tiny interregnum between the plane's cabin and the passenger boarding bridge, when he stepped over the threshold with 1 inch of exposure to the cold outside the cabin, Serge knew he'd miscalculated. Boss, I'm gonna need an advance on my first paycheck. I don't know about your layers, he motioned at Orlando's bone armor chest plate visible only to the two of them, but I am not dressed for this kind of cold, and I don't have any clothes to change into. Orlando agreed, and the two men found the first clothing store out of the enclosed gangway. Serge had been a Portland Trailblazers fan from birth, and not particularly interested in any other sports, despite his mother's efforts to make him cheer for the Chivas, the professional football club from her native Guadalajara. Now he found himself in a knit beanie advertising the Cleveland Cavaliers, competitors to his beloved Blazers. Mostly black, the hat's logo was maroon and beige, clashing slightly with his new leather jacket. Bright red and white stripes decorated the coat's shoulders, and the back had a huge emblem of a baseball with Art Deco wings, replicating the style of the famous statues overlooking the Hope Memorial Bridge, formerly known as the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge, and protecting the traffic there. Beneath the winged baseball, Serge's jacket was emblazoned with the name of the team and the statues. Guardians. I cannot help but feel this is fitting for us, Rolando said, and it may ingratiate us to the Lady of the Great Lake when we make her acquaintance. Sure, pander to the home team, Serge agreed. I just hope the coat is warm. Here, you will need this as well. Rolando handed Serge a long strip of brown fabric. Do they have Cavs or Guardians ones? I'm already not matching. I think it best you wear one advertising your support of the Browns. We do not know which sport the lady may like best, and this tends to be a football town. Then Rolando led Serge to a much higher-end store, where he purchased them both pairs of leather gloves. Serge looked at the coats and hats in the store. Were these too expensive? Of course not. Pick out whatever you want, but wear the Cleveland sports things to the meeting at the shore. The rental car desks were located in the baggage area, and the car Rolando picked, a Ford Bronco or similar, was delivered by one of the employees, after Rolando gave the attendant at the desk a ridiculously large tip for the service. So the men didn't experience the temperatures until they stepped out of the building and walked toward the already warming car. Holy shit, Serge shouted. It stings. Are my tears freezing in my eyeballs? To answer your earlier question, my armor does not provide nearly the protection against this cold I believed it would. By the bared breast of the Virgin, it's colder than my mother's disapproval out here, and she could freeze beer with a stare, I tell you. Serge broke into a jog for the two remaining steps to the idling car, pulled open the passenger side door, and waved Rolando in frantically. When he ran around and climbed into the driver's side, he found Rolando sitting on his hands, rocking from side to side, pressing them into the heated seat. I do not believe, in all my years and all my travels, I have ever experienced cold like that. How cold did you say it was? Like -10 degrees. Fahrenheit? Yep. That's... Rolando did the math. -23 degrees? I do not think that's possible. It feels like -25 when you account for the wind chill. What would that be in Celsius? Rolando calculated. 32 degrees below zero? Is Cleveland on the dark side of the moon? This is absurd. I think it must be a consequence of global climate change. I once had a chemistry and physics teacher in school who was kind of an expert on climatology, like not a climatologist, but it was his passion. And he told us he'd read another climatologist who said they never should have called it global warming or even climate change. Those may be more technically correct, but they confuse people because change is too vague and warming doesn't get at the fact that climate change will make winters colder. And every time people experience those colder winters, they'll say, see, the scientists are wrong, the world isn't getting warmer. This scientist said they should have called it global weirding because it's just going to make everything weird. But I don't think that's better marketing, really, because then as it becomes normal for everything to be weird, people will say, why should we care about carbon emissions? They said things would be weird, but all these forest fires and floods are normal now, so I guess this is no big deal. He shook his head. I don't know what would be a better thing to call it, like poisoning the air until we break all the natural systems-itis? That's just too long. I think it is a consequence of the curse, Rolando said. No, it's burning all the fossil fuels. Calling it magic would just confuse people even more. Rolando nodded while rubbing his hands together in front of his face. He breathed slowly into the space between them, but most of the benefits of his efforts came from stalling for time while the heated seats and the rental's coils warmed the air around them. I see your point.
It is not magic which is poisoning the air, but I think it might be the curse which makes people unable to see this clearly. It is the only explanation.
Stupidity is another explanation, and greed, and reluctance to change.
Yes, all these are true, but you will notice, none of these deniers park their cars inside sealed-up garages with the engines running and the tailpipe exhaust redirected into the windows with hoses. They know this is a means some people have employed to kill themselves. At least I saw it in a movie once, and it was presented as though the audience would understand this is what the character was doing, so I presume everyone knows this is deadly. Yet people are willing to drive around in much bigger closed garage and not believe scientists who say this same poisoning will kill us all more slowly, but just as dead. It makes no sense. If you were poisoning yourself in this way, would reluctance to change prevent you from turning off the engine and stepping out of the car, opening the garage door and stumbling into fresher air? Of course not. You would want that change. And would greed alone motivate you to stay in a poisoned car? You generally cannot pay a person enough to kill himself, since he will not gain the enjoyment of the dollars after his demise. Could a person really be stupid enough to stay in such a car as it filled with poison and deny what he smells and sees and feels? Perhaps some people, but I am not so cynical about the majority of the human race. And yet, acting together, we behave like the whole species killing ourselves. I suspect this must be the consequence of the enchantment. The same magic making people docile while their country goes to ruin must be affecting their judgment when it comes to polluting the air they must breathe, the water they drink.
Serge shrugged. Maybe. And maybe I'm just more cynical about people than you are. But look at me, I'm an Uber driver. Even though I sat through my teacher's lectures and know what I'm doing, I pour the distilled sludge of dinosaur bones and buried peat bogs into my gas-powered car and drive around all day. And never, not a single time, has anyone said, I need to get from the airport to my hotel, but I see that your car is going to kill my grandchildren, so I think I'll walk or take a bus. Even when we're voting, we say, sure, this candidate says she'll try to make changes to keep my grandchildren alive, but I don't believe she'll succeed. And the other guy seems like someone I would feel more comfortable drinking a beer with at a bar. So I'll vote for him, even though he says quite openly that he will keep everything the same and kill my grandchildren. So I don't know if it's stupidity or greed or fear of change or all three, but I don't see how magic has anything to do with it.
Rolando nodded. Yes, this is what we must discover, my squire. Is the curse making people fearful? Is it making them greedy? Is it making them too cynical to believe any change is possible? Or is the curse not related to this particular issue? We do not know, but perhaps the Lady of the Great Lake will have some insight for us. I am anxious to go see her now, but I think it might be better if we go at sunrise. It seems rude to call upon her at 20 hours.
Serge had to do the math, then looked at the blue glowing digits on the car's dash to see that Rolando was referring to 8 o'clock.
Let us find an hotel, one of these inexpensive ones you think are better use of money than the inn we purchased in Cornell, and we will go tomorrow morning.
So the men went to find a place to stay for the night, but first they made a stop at the Great Northern Mall and purchased some warmer clothes in Dillard's and a large duffel bag at Dick's Sporting Goods, so Serge could carry all their new belongings. Across the street they found a La Quinta Inn, and both felt this confirmed his side of the argument, that a genuine inn was preferable to a hotel. Benjamin spent the evening engaged in a short conversation with his parents about his next steps, then a long text exchange with his soon-to-be ex-wife. It began with mundane details about bills which had to be appropriately redirected. Then, in a forced effort to display that they were being supportive of one another, both examined the other's online dating profile and tried to offer helpful pointers which might help the other attract potential dates. Benjamin's soon-to-be ex offered to write him a letter of recommendation which he could show to women upon first meeting them. They both laughed sadly, acknowledging the awkwardness. Not for the first time, she told him she worried that now that he had some distance, he would fully discover all the anger towards her he'd been carrying around, barely confessing. And Benjamin continued to try, and fail, to convince her and himself that he was not angry with her. He was telling the truth when he said he wanted to remain friends, but he couldn't admit the degree to which that was motivated by vanity. He wanted to be the kind of person who was on good terms with his exes. If he'd been capable, he would have acknowledged he paid for her new apartment in Portland because he wanted to be the kind of person who didn't leave an ex homeless, even though he himself was left homeless as a consequence. Similarly, when he tried to explain his circumstances, he went out of his way to narrate his soon-to-be ex's behavior in spade amidst a litany of caveats about stress and mental health and neurodiversity. These choices to defend her were more selfish than he could admit. They served as a kind of bulwark for his pride, when everything else about his life screamed of his failure. But she was right. He was angry. He was a brass shell, an inexpensive mixture of copper and zinc just strong enough to resist the weather and contain 1/3 of a gram of gunpowder. He had no idea how soon he would explode. The two of them talked until the wee hours of the morning, occasionally touching on difficult issues, but always dancing around the few most important. The conversation exhausted them both, and around 4 a.m. they signed off, and Benjamin fell into a deep sleep punctuated by terrifying dreams. Upon waking, he couldn't remember the details, just that he was afraid and alone and didn't know who to run to for help. But long before he awoke from the horror movie marathon on his own local UHF station, Rolando shook Serge awake. He'd remembered Serge's preference for his own bed, so, though he thought it a bit unprofessional for a squire to not sleep on the floor at the foot of his master's bed, he'd acquiesced to a single room with 2 doubles. "Come, sit down, Sanchez," he said, his voice not a gentle whisper, but not a shouted command. "We should leave now if we are to meet the Lady of the Great Lake at sunrise." One of Serge's favorite things about driving an Uber was the hours. He got to sleep in every day and was rewarded with more fares later in the evening. The 3 hours time difference made the Cleveland pre-dawn darkness even more incomprehensible. "What time is it?"
6:30. The sun comes up at 7:45, but we should be there earlier, I think. Prepare yourself, and let us sally forth.
Serge, dressed in his new thermal long johns, heavy wool socks, jeans, snow boots, and the fancy expensive sweater Rolando had purchased for him the day before, then put on his Cleveland Guardians jacket, brown scarf, and Cavs beanie. Carrying the old clothes in a duffel bag, he put his gloves on in the elevator, and by the time he'd made it halfway across the hotel's lobby, he was sweating. But the heat contained in the layers fled when confronted by the bitter wind, which raced across the parking lot to meet him just outside the automatic doors, slapped him in the face, and then flipped him off as it reared back for another gust. "Oh, fuck you," he said to the wind and the cold and the hour and the darkness and the universe as a whole.
Agreed, Rolando said, most unpleasant.
Then he chuckled at a surprising memory.
You know, my father used to say, on mornings which were not nearly this cold in Spain, más frío que pecho de una bruja.
Colder than a witch's tit, Serge translated. I've heard that expression in English, too.
My father was not a warrior mage, Rolando explained.
They reached the rental, and he paused his story as they went around to their doors, bit down on a yelp as his ass and testicles touched the leather seat, and continued as Serge started the car and cranked all the knobs to their hottest settings.
He was a lord, like me. The title is inherited. But he did not concern himself with magic of any kind, a very practical man. So many years later, the first time I had dealings with a coven of witches, I was genuinely surprised to find they are not cold at all.
In fact, they are quite the opposite. He raised an expressive eyebrow. Serge felt the first hint of warmth from the car seat and the thought of a whole coven of witches. Did you...
My love for the Lady Nuria has not always protected me from every earthly temptation. As St. Augustine prayed, Da mihi castitatem et continentem sed roli modo. Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. And a coven of witches with their magic and their wiles, he shrugged. I was outnumbered, and, as you Americans say, outgunned.
Serge tried to focus on the road and not imagine seduction by a whole coven of comely witches while driving on icy roads to Edgewater Park. He found an empty lot near the iconic Cleveland script sign, a sculpture 6 feet high and 16 feet long, which said Cleveland in huge white letters in a distinctive font, the same font used for his Cavs hat. Behind the sign, tourists seeking selfies could capture a great image of the city from the hill, and even in the darkness amidst the storm, the downtown area still glittered, but the letters now carried mushroom caps of blobby snow holding fast against the bitter wind blowing up off the lake below them. Instead of turning to their right and walking toward the fancy playground equipment and the popular beach section of the park further to the east, Rolando led Serge down a boat ramp to their left, then further on to the west, where the lakefront became a thin trail buried in snow. Normally, this would be a sidewalk wide enough for hikers and bikers to pass one another comfortably, and a gentle drop-off would lead down to the lake a few feet below. But now the lake was frozen in such a way that it climbed 3 feet into the air and leaned out over the sidewalk at a menacing angle. So, Serge said, the Lady of the Great Lake is inside? He motioned to the chunk of ice that covered all 9,940 square miles of Lake Erie. This? Rolando tugged on the cords, which hung down from his new hat.
Perhaps she is inside this, and perhaps she is this. It's a bit of a metaphysical area of gray, he said.
Rolando had purchased himself a fancier hat than the one he'd bought Serge at the airport, judging after their brief run to the rental car that his thick hair was no match for the cold. At the Great Northern Mall, he'd offered to get Serge a new hat like his own, but the younger man had opted to stick with his cab's beanie rather than wear a large gray bubble of corduroy containing an interior lined with some long, soft black fur. It was not real mink, but it was expensive enough to appeal to people who can tell the difference between a fake fur designed to feel like mink and a fake fur designed to feel like rabbit. Long ear flaps hung down to leather cords, which could be tied under the chin, but Rolando let them dangle below his face, and Serge thought the hat couldn't have looked more ridiculous if Rolando tied them. So how do we get her to come out and talk to us, especially if she is the lake?
I admit I am not 100% certain, Rolando said. I think it would be most polite to simply ask her to come out and speak with us.
He shouted at the ice.
I am Sir Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona. I have come seeking the guidance of Ariel Honan, the Lady of the Great Lake.
He paused. Nothing happened. Serge shifted his weight back and forth from one foot to the other, trying to generate some heat. Rolando tried again, in a voice which was louder but sounded even weaker and more desperate.
Will the Lady of the Great Lake not come out to speak with us?
No response, but more freezing wind. Rolando looked at the surface of the lake, which stood at roughly waist height in front of him. He looked back up the hill toward the more popular part of the park, then shot a quick glance down the path to his left, scanning for dog walkers and joggers. He couldn't see anyone else in the pre-dawn gloom, but he suspected some people would brave the park, even in the bitter weather.
I could probably crack the ice with a spell that causes a clap of thunder, but it is quite loud, and I fear it will attract too much attention.
He scratched the top of his hat, causing the side flaps to wiggle up and down, the fur tickling his cheeks and mingling with his short beard like Velcro.
Well, I have been looking forward to showing you a couple of my favorite spells. I could send a wall of flame a distance into the water, melting the ice before us and creating a small section of the lake where Ariel Honan could meet with us. Or,
he tucked his cane under his arm, then made a gesture with his hands as though they caressed an invisible sphere between them. In the space, a small candlelight flickered, then ignited, creating a small globe of burning gas contained in a shell of magical force.
Would you like to see a spell called Fireball? Everyone loves Fireball.
Serge began nodding excitedly, but before he could find the words to express his assent, a new voice interrupted, coming from the direction the men least expected.
Don't you even fucking dare!
Both men's heads snapped in the direction of the voice, and Rolando's fireball vanished as he hid his hands behind his back like a guilty child. Ariel Honan stood on top of the ice 10 feet from them. She wore a dress made of deerskin, bare at the shoulders despite the below-zero temperature, and deerskin moccasin boots that came up to her knees. The dress was decorated with a geometric pattern made of dyed porcupine quills which had been stitched through the deer's hide. These white, blue, purple, and red bits of quill looked like jewels as they caught the glow of the sun which hadn't quite crested the horizon, and the design hinted at the gentle tidal waves of the lake turning into flowers as they touched the shore along the hem. Her build was squat and strong, her arms and shoulders muscular, one of her thick thighs visible along the outer hem of her dress. She had long jet black hair held in a single wide braid which hung in front of one shoulder and down past her elbow. While these features and her clothing matched the Allegheny people who once lived on those shores and gave Ariel Hanan her name, the rest of her appearance made it abundantly clear she was not at all human. Beneath her human hairline, her face was that of a panther, and where a human would have exposed skin, she had short golden fur of the North American variety. While her arms and legs looked human, her panther tail switched back and forth behind her, expressing her irritation and willingness to pounce, should Rolando continue with his previous plan. Serge felt that her cat face and swishing tail should have been the most disturbing things about her, but the characteristic he found most jarring was her voice. Her clothing may have been the gift of the Iroquois-speaking people who named her, but she spoke English with a modern Cleveland accent, which is to say, something that sounds like if a trumpet grew sinuses, which then acquired a phlegmy infection, or if every vowel were made by some kind of semi-aquatic long-necked bird trying to make its presence known on a long migration. And though this honking accent sounds both abrasive and amusing when coming from some humans, it sounded fitting and authoritative when coming from the living embodiment of the 11th largest body of fresh water in the world.
Jesus Christ, read the room, man, Ariel Hanan said. This is Cleveland. We're only a few miles from the Cuyahoga River, which caught fire 75 years ago.
She pointed over their shoulders to the south, and Serge noticed her hand had more hybrid qualities than the rest of her, the palm and insides of her fingers covered with tough, hairless, dark gray pads, and each digit ending not in a human fingernail, but a thick, shiny, retractable black claw.
You have no idea how much trouble people went through to get that all cleaned up. And now it's this beautiful waterway lined with fancy brew pubs and shit, and you're going to come here and start throwing fireballs on the river?
Rolando bowed deeply. My humblest apologies, Lady Ariel Honan of the Great Lake. I am Sire Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona, and this is my squire, Sira Sanchez of the town of Eels.
Serge decided not to interrupt to correct him.
I am pledged to the service of the Lady Nuria of Barcelona, and I am on a mission to discover the source of the curse upon this nation. We, he motioned to Serge, met with an Anhana in the city of Corvallis in Oregon, and she told us you might be willing to direct us to the person or persons who are responsible for this curse, if we would pledge ourselves to you. But of course, I cannot do so because I am pledged to another, and my vows prevent me from forsaking the Lady Nuria, so...
Rolando's voice began to creep up in pitch as he formulated his request, and as he got near to begging, it became ridiculously high.
We were wondering if you would be willing to help us despite our lack of a pledge of fealty?
Ha! Ariel Honan honked. The accent made the sound very loon-like, but the full view of her sharp teeth prevented the expression from being amusing.
Well, shit. I wasn't planning on having any knights errant in my army of Anhanas, but now that you mention it, I would like one of you to pledge yourself to me. How about you, Sir Guardian?
Serge wasn't sure who she was talking to, and only when he noticed Rolando looking at him did he remember his jacket said Guardians on the back. Who, me?
Rolando shook his head. Squire Sanchez is not a knight-errant, my lady. In fact, he has only come into my employ as a squire quite recently.
I'm his Uber driver, Serge explained.
We can change that, Ariel Honan said. I am the Lady of the Great Lake, one of them anyway. I have the authority to make you a knight.
Rolando shook his head back and forth in tight, shocked motions as he spluttered.
But I have not yet begun his training, my lady. He has not learned any magic or memorized his vows of chivalry. It is quite premature to make him a full knight-errant.
Ariel Honan walked towards them across the surface of the frozen lake, and though she didn't mean to be intimidating, her grace and visage made her approach more of a stalking.
Here, mount out on one knee,
she directed Serge, sounding almost absent-minded.
And let me see here.
She reached into the ice, her clawed hand completely disappearing, her wrist moving back and forth.
No, not that one. No, that one isn't right either. Ah, this is perfect.
She pulled her arm up, and there in her hand was a sword in a black leather scabbard, decorated with shiny chrome silver, which looked like a tree growing out of the sword's hilt, the bare branches turning into lightning bolts as they reached toward the scabbard's point. She pulled the sword out of its sheath, and the blade crackled with blue electricity. Because she was standing on the sheet of ice 3 feet above them, Ariel Honan had to bend down to touch the tip of the sword on both of Serge's shoulders. She did so with great care, not quite making full contact, and when the blade reached close enough, Serge felt 2 angry, vicious jolts of electricity which ran down through the length of his body and exited through his right foot and left knee where they made contact with the ground. He hissed and bit down on grunts of pain both times.
Feel that? Ariel Honan asked. Yikes, right? I dubbed thee Sir Sanchez of the town of Eels, guardian of, I don't know, justice or some shit. You could figure that part out. Rise, Sir Knight.
Serge stood, and before he could reply, she continued.
And I bequeath you this magic sword, Ba'aginawatig, the tree struck by lightning. May you use it to strike down your foes and bring glory to, well, to me, Ariel Honan, the Lady of the Great Lake.
Then she turned to Rolando, who stood next to his squire, frowning and shaking his head slowly.
I see you are not pleased, Sir Rolando, but I have a charge for you as well. Kneel.
Rolando took a step forward and started to lunge, then hesitated.
I cannot make any vow to...
Oh, I know, Ariel Honan scoffed. I won't make you betray your Lady Nuria.
He looked at the sheathed sword laying horizontally in the hands of his stunned former squire.
My sword is in something of a state of disrepair, my lady. Perhaps you could mend it or replace the blade with something akin to Sir Sanchez's impressive magical sword, if you would be so kind.
Let me see it.
Rolando knelt down on one knee, took his cane from under his arm, bowed his head as he leveled the cane before her. Ariel Honan took it, twisted the pommel made of Poe's skull until it clicked, and pulled the broken sword free. She examined the short fraction of a blade for a moment, then stuck it into the ice, her hand continuing down until all of Poe's skull was invisible. Then she swirled it around as though feeling for something in water.
No, not that one. Too similar. No, certainly not. Not more fire. Yes, that would do the trick.
She pulled her hand out of the lake of ice, and the blade was now intact, though significantly changed. It was still thin and short enough to fit inside Rolando's cane sheath, but now the blade looked like an impossibly scrawny ribbon of chipped volcanic glass, something that couldn't have been crafted by even the most skilled stonesmith without shattering the rock.
This is what you need, clearly,
Ariel Honan said. But won't it shatter again?
No, this is what makes this sword magical. It cannot break, no matter what. It will never get dull, and it will never shatter.
Rolando raised his eyebrows and nodded in appreciation.
It is called Maca de Waabide,
Ariel Honan said.
the black teeth. And I suppose you could use it as a saw as well as a sword, because those chipped points will never dull either.
Rolando slid the blade into the cane to make sure it fit, then pulled it out halfway to examine the strange blade again. He looked up at the Lady of the Great Lake. It is a marvel, my lady. Thank you.
Give it here,
she said, snapping her fingers. The pads on her palm and digits made a gentle muted sound, but the claws clicked like insects. Rolando handed her the sword and knelt before her. She unsheathed it and touched the stone to each of his shoulders, a pair of more satisfying taps than she'd given Serge.
Sir Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona, servant of the Lady Nuria, I charge you to instruct Sir Sanchez in knight-errantry as you continue your search for the origin of this land's curse. He is a knight-errant in training, until you declare his training complete and set him free to pursue his own adventures. There, does that make you feel better?
He stood slowly. Thank you, great lady of the Great Lake. I am honored by your gift, and will endeavor to accomplish the mission you have given me. He looked at Serge and gave a terse, decisive nod, then returned to Ariel Honan. Now, my lady, can you tell us who is behind the curse?
Oh, I don't know. That's why I've been sending my Anhana out to gather information for me. I sent them out to the places where rivers meet so they can hear rumors flowing in from two directions and deliver news to me. The one you spoke with is Brianna. I sent her to the mouth of the Luckamute, where it runs into the Willamette. But I had not heard back from her. I thought she might have been captured by whatever power is responsible for the curse. She is some distance from the rivers, in an inn where she is protecting some humans from a duende who was sent by someone who knows the source of the curse. Brianna suggested we talk to you to find out who sent the duende. Ariel Honan paced a bit on the surface of the ice. I do not know who is sending the duendes, but this might explain why I've been losing contact with some of my Anhanas. Perhaps others are waylaid by duendes too.
Or giants, Serge said. We also confronted a giant who'd been hired to cause mayhem. Maybe some of your Anhanas are dealing with them. Ariel Honan nodded.
It could be. I can't imagine an Anhana doing much to a giant, but if this mysterious person or group can command duendes and giants, they might be employing others too. I can't tell you who they are, but I have a suggestion about where to go next in your journey. My Anhanas seem to stop reporting in a consistent pattern. First I lost touch with Rihanna in Chicago at the mouth of the Mississippi, then Joanna in Sioux Falls, where the Floyd River meets the Missouri, then Lana in Ontario, Oregon, where the Snake meets the Payette, and then Brianna, who you met near the Willamette.
Wait, Rihanna, Joanna, Lana, and Brianna? Serge asked. He looked at Rolando. Rihanna the Anhana, Lana the Anhana. Ariel Honan nodded.
Yes, they are cute in every way. And I'm glad to hear Brianna's still alive and well. Maybe the others are fine also, and just distracted like she is. But go to Chicago and see if you can find Rihanna. Maybe she will have clues for you. And if it's worse, maybe she will need to be rescued.
Rolando smiled. I do like a good rescue. Serge shrugged. Sounds fine to me. I've never been to Chicago, and this route might take us back home to Oregon. But should we drive or fly? I think it's best we foray on land this time, Rolando said. We may need to do some exploring in places that are not close to major airports. Good. the newly dubbed Sir Sanchez said. He looked at Ariel Honan. I really like my new sword. Then back to Rolando, and there's no way I'm getting this onto an airplane. If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube or like and share on TikTok or Reels or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. Each week I'll give a shout out to some of the patrons. This week I'm thanking Substack followers Ausias Tsel, Vlada Marina, and Snark Avenue. Thank you all for your support. And a couple of shout outs this week to my fellow authors. You can pre-order RP Singletary's Speak Softly Among Icebergs via the link in the show notes. Kirkus says, a chaotic, manic novel about grief. Check out the description and I think you'll see why it's absolutely on my TBR list. And speaking of my TBR list, this week I learned about Shoeshine Boy and Cigarette Girl by P.A. Cornell, the Nebula, Aurora, and World Fantasy Award finalist. It's set in futuristic Toronto that also has a kind of 1930s, 40s vibe, and it was recommended by the great Tina Connolly, so I'm looking forward to checking that out. If any of you listeners are creators and have something to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com. See you back here next week for Chapter 8 of Tilting at Windmills. Teaser. Sir Orlando and Sir Sanchez get delayed in Cleveland by something you cannot predict. You cannot predict it because I haven't exactly figured it out yet, but I will. So join us for Chapter 8.